Today, I will tell you a story, one that was never meant to be spoken aloud. It is said to come from a scroll hidden beneath centuries of dust, a record of truths too heavy for the living to carry. So listen carefully, for this is not myth, it is memory. And now, we begin. In the last days before the silence, the temple stones still held the warmth of sacrifices and the echo of psalms, but the people's hearts had grown colder than the marble beneath their feet. Incense climbed the air in thin, uncertain lines, as if even the smoke did not know whether heaven was still listening. In those days there walked an old prophet whose name is not preserved in any canon, whose lineage is swallowed by time. He moved through the courtyards like a shadow that had outlived its owner, wrapped in a cloak, more patch than fabric. His eyes hollowed by too many visions that no one wanted to hear. He had not been called to palaces, nor consulted in the courts of kings. He spoke in marketplaces, at city gates, in alleys where broken jars and broken promises lay side by side. Children laughed at him. Merchants rolled their eyes and shifted their scales. Priests turned their faces away, lest his words expose the cracks in their polished rituals. Yet the word of the Lord still burned in him like embers beneath ash. On a day remembered only in fragments, the prophet was drawn, as if by an invisible hand, up the worn steps of the temple. The sky above Jerusalem was a dull, breathless gray, neither storming nor clear, like a held breath in the chest of heaven. The trumpets had finished their morning blast. The singers' last notes were still fading along the colonnades. He stood in the inner court, where generations of priests had lifted blood and smoke toward an unseen throne. His bones trembled, not from age, but from the weight of something drawing near and drawing away at the same time. There, between the pillars, he felt it, a vast retreating presence, not anger alone, but grief, as if a father, after calling his children for generations, had finally fallen silent because their hearts no longer knew his voice. The prophet opened his mouth to speak, and the air grew heavy. Pigeons in the rafters fell quiet. The clatter of basins ceased. A priest, about to slay a lamb, froze with a knife in his hand. Time thinned, and for a moment it was as in the days of Isaiah, of Jeremiah, of Ezekiel, when heaven bent low to whisper in human ears. His voice rose, cracked and raw, but it carried like a trumpet blast in a canyon. "You have filled the courts of the Lord," he cried, "but emptied your hearts of him. You honor him with lips that do not know how to tremble, and with hands that burn incense to idols in secret. You have asked for prophecy, as one asks for a sign in the sky, for wonder, for spectacle, for control, not for repentance." The words struck the stones and echoed back, as if the temple itself were answering him. "You have said, 'Where is the God of justice?'" he continued, tears mixing with the dust on his cheeks. "Yet you silence the orphan, crush the stranger, and price the poor by the weight of their hunger. You cry for his voice, but not for his will." A wind moved through the court without touching a robe or a beard. It stirred only the flames on the altar, bending them low as if in mourning. Somewhere a child began to whimper, sensing a fear older than language. The prophet's eyes lifted to the holy place, to the veil that hid the invisible. His knees buckled, for he knew what was coming. "Therefore," he whispered, and the whisper carried farther than his shout, "the Lord will give you what you have already chosen in your hearts. The heavens will grow still, the visions will cease, The lips of prophets will dry, and the dreams of the watchers will fade. The word you have treated as a noise in the market will depart from you, and you will learn the weight of its absence. His voice broke. For a heartbeat, he could not continue. Then, with the last strength in his failing body, he declared, "From this day there will be a long night upon the earth, not of sun nor of moon, but of the Spirit. You will still have kings and armies, feasts and fasts, but the voice will be far, farther than the stars you cannot count. And yet," he added, barely audible now, "in the depths of that silence a seed will grow, unseen, unheard, until the fullness of time comes, and the silence itself gives birth to a word." When he finished, the wind died, the flames straightened. The pigeons shook their feathers and began to coo again, as if waking from a dream. Priests muttered, unsettled but eager to return to their routines. A few scoffed that the old man had lost his senses. Others shrugged and said, "We have heard such things before." Only the stones remembered. The prophet felt the presence withdraw, not as a door slammed in anger, but as a hand released from a child who refuses to walk in the way. A great distance opened in the unseen places, a hollow silence settling over the land like invisible snow. He descended the steps of the temple slower than he had climbed them. No angel met him, no chariot of fire. He passed through the city gates and vanished into streets, already forgetting his face. Above Jerusalem, the sky remained the same, gray, ordinary, and unchanged. But heaven had already turned a page. The last echo of the prophet's voice faded into the cracks of the walls, into the seams of the scrolls, into the memory of God. And so the 400 years of silence began. When heaven closed its gates, the world felt it in ways too subtle for the unseeing and too heavy for the faithful. At first, it was only a thinning, a faint withdrawal in the air above the hills of Judea, a quiet that settled between the breaths of the priests, an absence in the spaces where visions once descended like fire. The elders noticed it first. They sensed it in the tremble of dawn prayers that no longer rose with the same warmth. They sensed it in the dreams that used to carry fragments of God's voice, dreams now fading before morning like mist swallowed by the sun. The watchers on the temple rooftops whispered among themselves that even the wind seemed untouched by the Holy One, moving without message, without meaning. Across the land, the places where heaven had once pressed close, the oaks of Mamre, the wells of the patriarchs, the lonely heights where prophets used to fall on their faces, all felt strangely hollow, as if the divine imprint had been gently lifted away, leaving only the outline. But the silence did not stop at Israel. In distant Babylon, astrologers stared at the night sky and saw the stars burn with their usual brilliance. Yet something was missing, a thread that had once connected wisdom to wonder. In Persia, the Magi performed their ancient rites, and though the flames rose sharp and bright, they revealed nothing, not a whisper, not a sign. It was as if heaven itself had folded its wings and withdrawn to a distance immeasurable. Some took the silence as mercy, a time to rebuild, to heal. Others feared it as judgment, a shutting of the door between realms. The priests in Jerusalem argued in hushed tones about whether God had stepped back or whether humanity had wandered too far to hear. But the truth was deeper. It lay in the unseen places where angels once walked openly among men. Even they felt the weight of the silence. The messengers who in ages past had carried visions to Daniel, comfort to Elijah, warning to the fathers, now stood waiting at the thresholds of heaven. Their voices bound. They watched the earth in stillness, forbidden to speak, their radiance dim to the faint shine of memory. In the temple itself, a strange thing began to happen. Each day the incense rose, but the scent seemed weaker, as if the smoke no longer carried the same hunger for God, or perhaps heaven no longer breathed it in. The songs of the Levites echoed cleanly off the walls, but not beyond them. Their harmonies, once woven with unseen choirs, fell flat against the air, like feathers that refused to lift. The people continued their sacrifices, but they did so with hands that trembled less from awe and more from habit. And soon a generation was born that had never heard the thunder of a prophet, never seen a vision shake a nation, never felt the nearness of the Almighty like heat in their bones. They grew up thinking silence was normal. For the first time since Abraham walked beneath the stars, the world moved without a word from its maker. Kingdoms rose, kingdoms fell, armies marched, children were born, the seasons turned, and through it all the heavens watched, unmoving, unreadable, unreachable, not in anger, not in abandonment, but in a silence deeper than judgment, a silence that waited. Beneath the blackened stones of an old military outpost north of Jerusalem, a group of scribes searched for remnants of pre-exilic records. They expected nothing more than shattered pottery and weather-worn tablets. Instead, in a hollow beneath collapsed beams, they found a scroll wrapped in scorched linen, a scroll that had no right to survive fire or time. Its surface was darkened, its edges curled like burned leaves, but the ink, though faded, still clung to the parchment with a stubborn, trembling life. The script was ancient, older than what the priests used, older even than the exile inscriptions carved in Babylonian stone. They unrolled it slowly. The parchment crackled like dry bones. At first the lines seemed ordinary, genealogies, ritual notes, records of offerings long forgotten. But deeper into the scroll, the handwriting changed. It became sharper, frantic, as though the scribe had written in fear or urgency. And then the words spoke of the silence. Not the silence the people knew, but one foreseen. The voice, the fragment read, will withdraw, not because man has sinned, but because man no longer fears the sound of heaven. Another line, he will step back until hearts remember trembling. And another, the covenant of stone will remain, but the covenant of breath will fade, for breath is easily lost. The scribes froze. They had never seen prophecy written outside the canon, never seen a warning preserved by someone whose name had vanished from history. One verse had been nearly erased by heat, yet its ghostly lettering remained. There shall be a rift, unseen by earth, felt only by the throne. For the ways of men will no longer align with the ways of the heavens, and until alignment is restored, the mouth will be shut. The men looked at one another, unsure if they held a revelation or a curse. But then they reached the final fragment, so damaged that only glimpses of meaning survived. It spoke of a fracture beyond human sight. Light dimmed between the realms. The watchers restrained. The cry of the holy ones unheard. The world left to choose its own path. The last line was clearer than all others, as though protected by something unseen. In the long silence, a seed is hidden, Only in silence can it grow. The scribes felt the hairs rise on their arms. Some backed away, as if the scroll itself breathed. Others fell to their knees, sensing a weight they could not fully bear. For the first time since the prophet's final cry, something of heaven had surfaced. Not a voice, not a vision, but a memory preserved by trembling hands long dead. They wrapped the scroll again and hid it deeper in the archives, afraid that if the people saw it, fear would break what remained of their fragile faith. Above them, the night sky stretched wide and starless, and though the world did not know it, the silence had just revealed its first shadow. As centuries turned like grinding millstones, kingdoms rose and collapsed in the vacuum where prophecy once thundered. Without a guiding voice, history moved like a river freed from its banks, swelling, swallowing, reshaping everything in its path. Persia, once a pillar of order, began to tremble under its own weight. The old roads that carried decrees to distant provinces now carried whispers of revolt. Governors fought like wolves for territory. The great king's reach weakened, and the empire's breath grew thin. Into that widening gap marched Alexander. He swept across the ancient world like a blade drawn in moonlight, sudden, sharp, unstoppable. Cities fell before him as though pushed by an invisible hand. The priests of Israel watched from afar, standing on the temple steps, whispering among themselves, if God still spoke, would he not warn us of this? But heaven remained sealed, and so the Greek tide washed over Judea without a single prophetic word to meet it. At first it brought knowledge, new languages, new philosophies, new ways of thinking that shimmered like polished bronze. But knowledge without wisdom is a fire without a hearth. The silence of God left men to interpret the world by their own fragile brilliance. In the courts of the Greeks, scholars debated the nature of the soul while ignoring the nature of holiness. Some welcomed their ideas like a fresh wind. Others feared them as a subtle poison. Temples to foreign gods rose in cities where psalms once filled the streets. The old men remembered the prophet's warning. You will still have kings and armies, feasts and fasts, but the voice will be far. Now they understood. Without the voice, nations marched without restraint. Without the voice, philosophies filled the void where revelation once dwelled. Without the voice, Israel began to fracture from within. When Alexander died, his empire shattered like a clay jar dropped on stone. The fragments became new kingdoms, all hungering for power, all pulling the land of Israel into their wars like a scrap of cloth caught between dogs. The Seleucids to the north, the Ptolemies to the south. Their armies trampled the land with iron-souled certainty, claiming it as a prize neither fully understood. Through all this, no prophet rose to speak. No dream warned the priests. No angel appeared in the night. The silence stood unmoved, like a mountain at the center of their history. The people prayed, but their prayers seemed to fall back upon their own shoulders. The priests offered sacrifices, but the smoke felt directionless. The wise searched the heavens for signs, but the stars refused to rearrange themselves. And yet, in the midst of shifting empires, there were moments, small, easily overlooked, where something unseen threaded itself through the chaos. A scribe in Alexandria began translating the ancient Hebrew words into Greek, a task no one thought significant. A family in Jerusalem preserved an old lineage that seemed unimportant at the time. A stone mason in Nazareth carved beams for a home that would one day shelter the impossible. History moved like a storm, wild and ungoverned, but beneath it something delicate was forming, like a root growing in darkness, untouched by the noise of kingdoms. The silence was not empty. It was shaping. In the 2nd century of silence, far from Jerusalem's dust and ritual, a lone astronomer in Babylon kept watch over the night sky from the roof of a weather-worn observatory. His name is lost to history, but fragments of his notes survived, fragments that later scholars would handle with trembling fingers. He spent his life studying the stars as his fathers had before him, but unlike most who traced the heavens for omens, he did so with reverence, believing the sky to be the last scripture still unaltered by men. For decades, the constellations moved with the precision of a divine clock, until one winter night when something broke the pattern. A star, faint at first, appeared near the eastern horizon. Not a new star, not a comet, not a wandering planet. He wrote the word stranger. It moved against the order of creation, gliding with an intelligence not bound to the slow revolutions of the firmament. It crossed constellations as though searching for a place that remembered it. No star behaved this way. None dared violate the paths carved at the dawn of time. The astronomer watched for hours, then nights, then months, recording every deviation with trembling strokes. He noticed something more unsettling. As the star moved, the rest of the heavens seemed to dim around it, not in darkness, but in deference, as if acknowledging a messenger whose origin lay beyond the known spheres. He began to fear that the silence of God had not only reached the earth, but had seeped into the heavens themselves. There were nights when the star paused completely, holding its place as if listening. He would stare with bated breath, wondering whether it awaited a command from a realm no longer speaking. Then, without warning, it would resume its wandering course. He wrote in the margins, "It seeks, it hesitates, it mourns." And once, in a moment of fear or revelation, it is an angel that has forgotten its wings. Toward the end of his life, he attempted to share his findings with the temple astrologers of Babylon. They dismissed him. Some called him deluded. Others warned him to stop, fearing he would unsettle the fragile order of the priesthood. His final years were spent in isolation, watching the sky with the gaze of someone who sees more in the darkness than in the daylight. Then, one night, the star flared, not brighter, but clearer, as if shedding a veil. He wrote only one sentence before the ink ran dry. "It waits for a child who is not yet born." When his observatory was found decades later, part of the ceiling had collapsed. His final star charts were scorched, though no fire had touched any other part of the structure. The strange star was absent from the sky. It would not be seen again for over 100 years, and the silence deepened. South of Judea, where the desert stretches into a vast sea of ash-colored dunes, caravans told stories that no priest wanted to hear. Stories of shadows moving beneath the sand, of shapes glimpsed at the edge of lantern light, of voices that were not carried by wind. Most travelers dismissed them as illusions born of heat and exhaustion. But those who knew the ancient writings feared otherwise. For in the days before the silence, Enoch had spoken of the watchers, angels who descended and defied the order of heaven, bound in darkness until the final judgment. Their prisons, he wrote, lay deep beneath the deserts, in places where no rain falls and no roots take hold. During the centuries of silence, something began to stir in those forgotten depths. It started with tremors, small, rhythmic, like the slow heartbeat of the earth. Then came the cold spots in the sand, where frost formed in patterns that resembled wings, and always there were the whispers, not in any human tongue, but in tones that vibrated in the bones rather than in the ears. Caravan leaders began avoiding the valley entirely, calling it the place of the sleeping stars, for the sky above it seemed dimmer, as though even the heavens refused to shine on what lay buried below. One night, a group of shepherds moving their flocks between wells saw something rise briefly from the dunes, tall, gaunt, and radiant, with a faint, sickly glow. It had no face, only the suggestion of one, like a mask carved from moonlight. Its form was not solid. It rippled as though woven from smoke and memory. The shepherds fled, swearing they felt their souls recoil from it. They spoke of eyes that were not eyes, of a presence that felt restrained, as though it longed to speak but was bound by a law older than creation. Word reached the scribes in Jerusalem, who privately recalled the warnings found in the scorched scroll. The watchers restrained, the cry of the holy ones unheard. The meaning became clearer. If heaven had sealed its voice, then even the imprisoned watchers, those beings of ancient rebellion, were silenced with it. Their confinement had once been held firm by the constant authority of God's active presence in the world. But now, for the first time, even their chains seemed to loosen, not break, but loosen. Just enough for their shadows to tremble. Travelers spoke of moments when the desert wind shifted direction all at once, as if recoiling from something unseen. Others found deep, narrow fissures in the ground that pulsed with pale light before closing again. And always there was the same feeling, as if something ancient and sorrowful pressed close to the surface, yearning for a world that had long forgotten its name. The priests refused to address the rumors. The scholars dismissed them. The kings ignored them. But the people felt it, a presence that did not belong, a reminder that when heaven goes silent, even the depths of the underworld begin to murmur. The watchers did not rise. They were still bound. Yet their unrest was a sign that the silence of God reached even into the darkest prisons of creation. In the years when prophecy had turned to dust and the heavens held their breath, a small brotherhood of scribes met in secret chambers beneath Jerusalem. They gathered not in defiance of kings, but in fear of heaven's silence, for they believed that if the world no longer heard the voice, then humanity's memory of it must be preserved by human hands. They called themselves the keepers of the night lamp. Their chamber lay beneath the old quarter, carved into bedrock by generations long forgotten. Only the faintest glow of oil lamps lit the stone walls, where shelves overflowed with scrolls, fragments, and broken clay seals. The air was heavy with parchment dust and the scent of ink that never fully dried. Each night, after the city's noises faded, the scribes descended the narrow stairs, carrying what little remained of the prophetic tradition. They copied genealogies, restored damaged psalms, traced the fading lines of prophecies whose meaning was now as distant as the stars. But something strange happened in those nights. The silence that crushed the prophets did not fully reach the depths of the chamber. When the scribes bent over their work, the flames of the lamps flickered, not from draught or breath, but in rhythm, as though responding to something unseen. Some nights, the ink seemed to flow more easily, the lines forming with unnatural clarity. Other nights, the letters trembled as if resisting the quill. They tried not to speak of it, but all felt it. The lamps would flare when a passage of warning was restored. They would dim when a prophecy of mercy was written. And sometimes, only sometimes, a faint warmth pressed against their backs, like the nearness of a presence standing just beyond the boundary of sight. One scribe, the youngest among them, confessed quietly that he heard something in the flames. Not a voice, not words, more like memories rising from the fire. He said it felt like listening to a prayer that had once been spoken in the courts of heaven. The elders hushed him, not because they doubted him, but because they feared the implications. If heaven was silent, then what were they feeling? If the voice had withdrawn, then whose memories flickered in the flames? The oldest of the keepers believed that God's silence did not mean absence, only restraint. That while his voice no longer shook the mountains, his memory still lingered in the sacred texts, waiting for the world to desire it again. So they worked by lamplight, writing even when their hands shook from exhaustion, preserving every syllable that hinted at the divine. Their ink-stained robes bore witness to nights when their eyes burned from smoke and tears smudged the parchment. They wrote of kings who had risen and fallen, of covenants made and broken, of promises that stretched like threads from Eden to the unknown future. But beneath everything they preserved was a single, unspoken fear that if the written word faded, humanity would forget that God had ever spoken at all. So, they labored in darkness, stitching together the remnants of a revelation that no longer came. Their quiet devotion formed the thin, fragile bridge between the age of prophets and the age of silence. They could not know that their hands were preparing the world for a voice that would not come from a burning bush or a trembling mountain, but from the cry of a child who had not yet entered the world. In the final century of silence, when the old men no longer expected visions, and the young had never heard a prophecy in their lifetime, a strange event stirred the temple, so subtle that it was almost dismissed, yet so unsettling that those who witnessed it never spoke of it again. It happened during the night watch. The priests moved through the inner courts with practiced stillness, tending the lamps, trimming wicks, replacing spent oil. The temple was quiet at that hour, filled only with the soft breathing of flames and the muffled steps of sandals on stone. Then, a sound, faint, soft, impossible. A child's cry, not loud, not distressed, more like the fragile whimper of an infant waking from sleep. It drifted through the pillars, bouncing off the golden walls, slipping beneath the great bronze doors of the holy place. The priests froze. No children were allowed inside the inner courts after dusk. No families, no pilgrims, no one who could have produced such a sound. The temple at night was a world sealed to all but consecrated men. The cry came again, slightly louder this time, echoing with an unnatural clarity, as though the very stones were carrying it. The youngest priest trembled. The oldest one turned pale, gripping the edge of a lampstand. They searched every corner of the temple, lifting curtains, checking storerooms, even examining shadowed alcoves behind the great veils. There was nothing, not a child, not a footprint, not even a shift in the incense smoke. Just the echo of a sound that should not have existed. The youngest asked in a whisper, "Could it be a sign?" The elder shook his head sharply. "A sign requires a voice. There has been no voice for generations." And yet, the tremor in his hands betrayed him. When they returned to the holy place, the lamp flames swayed, not from wind, but in a pattern, as though stirred by something passing between them. The air carried a warmth that did not belong to fire. Later that night, after the watch had ended, the oldest priest sat alone in the court of Israel, listening to the silence settle over the stones again. The moon poured pale light across the floor, revealing nothing. The night seemed unchanged, ordinary, but the priest could not forget the sound. He had heard too many infants cry in his lifetime not to recognize what lay hidden in that single trembling note. A beginning, not yet born, not yet seen, not yet revealed, but moving. Something had pierced the silence, not with thunder, not with prophecy, with a cry that carried the weight of heaven preparing to awaken. Some said later that it was the echo of the final prophecy finally taking shape. Others whispered that the child's cry was not of earth at all, but the future reaching backward, touching the present like a shadow cast from a light that had not yet risen. Whatever it was, it came only once, never again. And the next morning, the temple resumed its rituals. The people resumed their prayers, and the priests carried the memory like a stone in their chest. Heaven had remained silent, but the silence had shifted. Decades after the night when the temple stones carried the cry of an unseen child, a fragment of an apocryphal text surfaced among the scholars of the Eastern diaspora. It was not a full scroll, only a torn sheet, brittle, water-stained, its ink fractured into islands of fading black. Most dismissed it as damaged liturgy or a corrupted genealogy. But one line changed everything. It spoke of an angel descending during the time of silence, only once, only briefly, and with a message sealed from the world. The fragment began in the middle of a sentence. And the messenger was restrained, for the decree of heaven forbade speech in those days. That alone unsettled the scholars. But the next line froze them completely. Yet he came bearing a name that was not yet spoken on earth. The parchment broke there, a jagged wound across sacred meaning, but the remaining text revealed enough to shake those who read it. It described an encounter in the hills near Hebron with a man whose identity had been lost to time. The angel did not shine with the blinding fire of Isaiah's visions, nor with the terror that once felled Ezekiel to the ground. He appeared instead like a traveler in the twilight, radiance dimmed, voice bound by the decree that sealed heaven. Unable to speak, the angel placed something in the man's hands, a small sealed tablet with no inscription. The man, trembling, asked for its meaning. The text says only, "And the messenger touched his lips with silence, for the word was not yet born." After this, the narrative fractures again, but one final paragraph survived, written in a different hand, as though added by a witness long after the original event. It reads, "The man who received the tablet hid it in the stones of his house, and though he prayed for understanding all his days, None came. The silence of God remained. Yet the angel's eyes carried a joy that no silence could conceal. Therefore I say, the silence itself was expecting. When scholars presented the fragment to the priests in Jerusalem, they were dismissed, even rebuked. Heaven does not contradict itself, the high priest insisted. If the heavens are sealed, no messenger descends. But a few of the younger scholars saw something else, not contradiction, but continuity, a thread, a whisper, a crack in the silence. One of them, a quiet man who rarely spoke, wrote in his personal notes, "A word is coming, not spoken yet, but carried. Heaven bends around its arrival." The others scoffed at him, but he held fast to his interpretation, because the fragment hinted at something profound, that the silence of God was not the end of revelation, but the preparation for one final message, one final name, one final word. And though the text never revealed who the angel had visited, nor what the sealed tablet contained, nor what name he bore in silence, the implication settled over the scholars like dawn, breaking through fog. The silence was waiting for someone. For 4 centuries the silence ruled the earth like an unseen monarch, a reign without voice, without vision, without fire or whisper. Generations lived and died without hearing a single word from heaven. Children were born beneath that hush and grew old believing it was normal. Priests aged in their service, offering sacrifices into a sky that answered with nothing but its unbroken stillness. But silence is not emptiness, and absence is not abandonment. Something had been forming in the dark. It began as all divine things begin, quietly, in places overlooked by kings and scholars. Far from the marble courts of Jerusalem, far from the libraries of Alexandria, far from the astrologers of Babylon, a small village lay tucked between hills and terraces of olive trees. The world did not watch it. No scribe marked its importance, no soldier guarded its dust. Nazareth, a name that carried no weight, a town that carried no prophecy. Yet in that silence, in that forgotten corner of history, threads woven across centuries finally converged. The unrest of the watchers beneath the desert, the wandering star that sought a purpose, the cry in the temple that had no child, the sealed message of the angel who could not speak, the scorched scroll warning that a seed lay hidden in silence. All of it pointed to a moment the world was unprepared for. When the fullness of time arrived, it did not come with the roar of Sinai or the trembling of Ezekiel's visions. It came with the sound of a woman's breathing in a quiet room, the tightening of her hands around a rough wooden beam, the gasping pain of labor in the dim glow of a lamp. And then, after 400 years of silence, a voice, not a prophecy, not a decree, a newborn's cry, raw, fragile, unmistakably human, but it carried something the world had forgotten, a resonance older than mountains, a vibration the prophets once heard in dreams, a tremor that reached not just ears, but the marrow of creation itself. The silence broke, not like shattering glass, but like dawn, a single cry echoing across the unseen realms, stirring the angels who had stood in stillness for generations. Their voices, long restrained, rose again, trembling with joy remembered. The wandering star stopped in its path, as though it had finally found what it had been searching for. The desert winds that whispered around the prisons of the watchers stilled. The lamps in the scribe's chamber flickered with a warmth they had not felt in centuries. Heaven bent low once more, and a name, the name withheld through centuries, the name sealed on a tablet the angel could not speak, finally entered the world, a name that would restore what had been fractured, a name that would make the silence meaningful, a name that would turn absence into invitation. The word had returned, but not as a thunderbolt, not as a king with armies, not as a prophet with fire, as a child. The 400 years of silence ended in a manger too small for its significance, beneath a star that had waited lifetimes to stop, in a town no one valued. And in that fragile beginning, the world heard again what it had long forgotten. God still speaks, but sometimes he prepares his greatest word through silence.